Here at Flow FM, we've been looking forward to ABARES December numbers on just where our cropping is heading. Dr. Jared Greenville is the Executive Director at ABARES. Jared, how are you today?
Very well, thank you, and good to be back on.
Yes, we did talk last time that we would look for some revisions of exactly where our cropping numbers were going to be in December. Looks like a bit of a mixed bag depending on which state you're in.
Yeah, it certainly is. Yeah, and there's been a fair few revisions across the board, not to be unexpected given the weather conditions that we've had over the last quarter. But what we're seeing is really that mixed story. At a national level, we're seeing some really good numbers coming out of WA and South Australia. As we get to the east, a little bit more mixed. And what we're expecting overall, though, the national picture in terms of our overall agricultural production to be really strong and almost hit the record that we saw hit last year, around $85 billion, backed up by record levels of exports, around $72 billion. But what we're seeing is a bit of a mixed story, particularly in New South Wales, which has borne the brunt of much of the flooding so far.
Yeah, and I noticed some positive figures. We know Mallee is a difficult area to farm at times, and they're pretty tough folks down in the Mallee, but it looks like your Victorian Outlook is also pretty positive for those in Victoria, at least there was some distance from waterways.
Yeah, that's right. So particularly the Mallee and the Wimmera, where we've seen the weather systems that brought some pretty high rainfall across the rest of the country also benefited them, but to the extent that they've promoted some yields and some production. And so we're seeing some high production, much higher production than forecast out of those regions. But that's been offset by some of the northern regions where we've seen about a 7% crop abandonment so far, which is bringing down the numbers. And so Victoria's staying fairly steady compared to what we thought it would be in September, with those swings and roundabouts across the state.
Now, you mentioned crop abandonment. It's a horrible scenario to even think about, but let alone for those experiencing it on the ground. But in New South Wales, that figure, I think, is even worse.
Yeah, that's right. So at the moment, we're expecting there to be around 16% of the area that was planted to be abandoned because of the floods that have gone through. That accounts for about 2 million tonnes of winter crops. So it's quite a lot of product that's been taken out. And there's also some continued risks, including in Victoria, around what will be the full extent of some of the waterlogged areas. And harvest is being delayed because of the cooler conditions, and we could even get more wet conditions come back in. So that is a bit of a watch point, is to see how the rest of the season plays out, because we're not done yet.
And then there's the summer cropping scenario. For some, the ground's still too wet to even get something in the ground for the summer.
Yeah, and this is particularly affecting both rice production and cotton production. There's significant amounts of water around, and we're expecting a significantly smaller rice crop this year. And same goes with cotton, that the weather and the water that's slow moving and around is really putting a dampener on the ability of people to get out on paddocks and to plant. And so that will have put a bit of a dent into some of the summer crops.
And when it comes to South Australia, we were commentating about how they did get off to a later start. They're going to have a pretty tough old Christmas. The farmers across southeastern Australia harvesting probably right through even on Christmas Day potentially. But South Australia, at least the upside is there's a pretty big crop coming in there.
Yeah, it's close to a record crop in South Australia, we're seeing overall. And yes, as you say, the harvest is still going and coming in, but some of the yield numbers that we saw coming out of the early harvest in South Australia were really quite high. And so there's quite a bit of optimism as to what's going to come out and where South Australia will end up.
Yeah, I notice, I think you've got there 11.2 million tonnes for South Australia projected for this year. The PIRSA, the State Department, talked about 12.1 million tonnes, but there may be some date overlap about exactly where that is. But those sit pretty high in the historical records for South Australia.
Yeah, they do, yeah. And so they're well and truly up there. And it's a really good result, given everything else that's going on across the eastern seaboard, to see that, and also to come back after what has been, I guess, a troubled few years overall over a long history, to see such high yield rates coming out of South Australia.
Now, we've tracked in the market certainly the positives when it comes to the prices for the product, which is a bit of a buffer, it seems to us, when it comes to, even if your quality's down, you're still getting a reasonable price, but you're also projecting that some of these input costs are on their way down, or levelling out at least at last.
Yeah, we've seen some of the pressure taken out of the fertiliser and fuel prices that really, I guess, plagued much of the planting season and also over the last little bit. with those prices starting to ease back a little bit. But I have to say that certainly the energy market side of the equation, as Europe goes into winter as well, is one where there's considerable uncertainty. That war in Ukraine is still going, and that's continuing to lead to uncertainty in international markets around supplies of energy and also supplies of global grains. And so while it looks to be starting to ease, we're quite there's a high degree of uncertainty associated with that.
And then I notice there's a broader graph you've got on here as well, the expectation in terms of rainfall going forward. Obviously, we rely on Bureau of Meteorology and others to project that, but how much does that feed into your forecast even for the coming year?
Yeah, so we try and make the most of what the Bureau can give us and the expectation as what goes on. One of the things, I guess, coming into where we look forward into the next season will be that there'll be significant degrees of soil moisture around, and that should set the sector up pretty well for a good cropping season, irrespective of what happens with the rainfall. They're starting to predict the La Nina will start to break down, and we could even start to go into an El Nino into the next period. But there should be a little bit of a buffer there to hopefully ease that impact if that was to eventuate. But we'll hope for more neutral conditions as we go into next year.
Yeah, and lastly, the always a difficult exercise for farmers to know just what they're going to get in future years. But see, with this $100 billion of agricultural production by 2030 has been the broadly agreed target across agriculture. Do you sort of project outwards from the next financial year forwards, or we can only look 1 year ahead of just whether we're tracking well to that target?
Well, we'll take a bit of a look in March in our forecast, where we'll try and look out across 5 years and see what the landscape's going to look like. Obviously, weather then starts to play a significant role, but coming back to those prices, and while it is difficult and there's a whole bunch of volatility in the markets, we do expect those prices to stick around still for a few years to come. We've got a number of areas across the world likely having a repeat of a poor season this year, and there'll be a bit of a rebalancing of production if the weather systems start to change around. But we'd still expect the prices over at least the next couple of years or the next year or so to remain a bit higher or elevated, unless there's a significant change in some of the geopolitical arrangements and wars and the like as we look forward.
Almost as many variables as farming itself. It's good to check through them with ABARES. Thank you, Executive Director Dr. Jared Greenville, for joining us today on Flow.
Excellent. Thanks again for having me on.